Welcome to 06880, the podcast. Reverend Allison Patton was ordained in 2000 and has been pastor of Saugatuck Congregational Church since 2012. She develops all-ages worship services, leads retreats and youth camps, serves on statewide committees, and is part of Westport's interfaith community. She's committed to her church's social justice mission and to all of Westport. So welcome, Reverend Patton, to the podcast.
Thank you, Dan.
So I'm really glad that you're here today, and not just here in the library, but here in Westport, and as my neighbor. I live next door to the church.
That's right.
So what got you here?
10 years ago, you mean? What got me here? I was serving a church up in Simsbury, Connecticut, and had been looking for a next call for probably a couple of years. I was serving on a larger staff of a larger church and was interested in serving as a solo pastor in a new community. I met the folks at Saugatuck Church for the first time prior to the fire at the church, had one interview with them. And then a few weeks went by, they continued their search, I continued doing my thing, and then the fire happened 10 years ago on November 21st.
It was a bad fire.
It was a bad fire. It was a destructive fire. It didn't take down the entire church, but we lost a third floor and made the building uninhabitable for 3 years. But they called me back for a second interview just a couple of weeks after the fire. And I was feeling pretty agnostic at the time about the position. I hadn't spent much time here and thought they've been through something devastating, and really my role is to just come and hear what that has meant for them. And during that conversation, which was, again, just a couple of weeks after the fire, one of the members of the church, Russ Brenneman, dearly departed, longtime member, an active member of this community, remarked that he hoped that the fire would deepen their sense of empathy for the struggles of others. And I was so struck by the capacity to be open like that to the pain of others at this moment that was so devastating for the community. That got my attention. We had a dynamic conversation, and a couple weeks later, they called and offered me the position and persuaded me that this was a creative, engaged, progressive community that would be a good fit for me. My husband and I came and visited and said yes. Wow. I started on May 1st of 2012.
Without a church?
Without a church building, that's right. We started worshiping over at Temple Israel, and for the first 2.5 years of my ministry, that was my sanctuary away from home, and we called ourselves the Church Without Walls, and had lots of conversation about what it means to be a community and a community of faith apart from the building that we occupy. Yeah, it was a really dynamic time. It was also my introduction to the community of Westport and the remarkable partnerships that are possible here and which preceded me. The outpouring of support for Saugatuck Church after the fire was remarkable. And for 2.5 years, we couldn't do anything without community partners. It was a great introduction to Westport for me because folks stepped up and shared their spaces and shared their energy and collaborated with us in all kinds of ways that continue now that we have our own building.
Any particular moments or remarks or things that people did that stand out from that time? I'm sure there are many.
So within the interfaith community, there was the invitation by Temple Israel for us to use their space, and the observation at the time that the offer was sort of reciprocal because Saugatuck Church had hosted Temple Israel 40 years prior when they were building their synagogue. Oh. So that was fun. Green's Farms became host to our memorials and our funerals because of the shared religious tradition and architecture. That was a place of great comfort for folks at a time of saying goodbye to a loved one. And then Christ and Holy Trinity gave us their space at times when Temple Israel couldn't. So those various offers that all added up to everyone sort of sticking their hand in the air and saying, we can do this. The Methodist Church shared a number of worship services with us over that time. And then beyond the interfaith community, I think the messages that we got from the town of initially of condolence, financial gifts that were made by various individuals and organizations to help us rebuild, and the degree to which people welcomed me before they knew me, Allison, right, but just knew that I was the pastor of Saugatuck, and showed up on my doorstep and said, we're thinking of you.
Wow.
So I guess that it's not so much that I remember individual moments, but that collective response by the community was something I still remember.
Yeah. The church itself is where Westport began.
Yeah.
It was, the building was not where it is now, even though it looks perfectly situated.
That's right. Yeah.
It was diagonally across the street where the gas stations are now.
Yep.
And it was moved across the street in 1950. But the pews are where Westport was chartered in 1835.
That's right. And then the charter was posted on a big tree, I think a maple tree that stood out in front of the church itself. Wow. Yeah, it was sort of the bulletin board of that time.
So what does that mean to you, the fact that your church is the birthplace of the town of Westport?
So it's an interesting dynamic, and not uncommon, right, for that time period that the congregational churches of the day were also the town halls. So in that sense, it's typical. It is the first iteration of the partnership that we have continued to have with the town, and the nature of that partnership has changed over the years. But we do like to think of ourselves as the church in the heart of Westport, right? Have the advantage of being right downtown where we can see what's going on and folks can see us and we can offer our space in all kinds of ways. So that's continued to be meaningful. One of the things that we've just started to dig into or to talk about as a congregation is also the fact that we occupy land that was once tended by the Paugussett and by other indigenous communities. So we are also trying to look back prior to that founding of the church and then the town to remember that there were others here on the land before we arrived, and to think about the implications of that for our own ministry, and trying to at least start by acknowledging that. I don't know where else that will take us, but it's beginning to be part of our conversation.
I hadn't realized that.
Yeah,
I did not realize that was a Native American land.
So it's actually all of this part of Westport, and we are indebted to the work of the Westport Museum for History and Culture on one side of us and the Westport Country Playhouse on the other side of us, both who have done more intentional work around looking at that heritage, and it's partly their research that has informed our own understanding. So it's all along here, and all along the coast, really, was Paugussett land, and I say other indigenous peoples because we don't know precisely which tribes were where.
And you're still trying to figure out what that means for the congregation and for Westport as a whole?
Yeah, I think some of it is acknowledging that that's part of our story, that it's land that was not voluntarily ceded. In our community of faith, we talk about the power of confession, and sometimes we confuse that with being guilt-ridden. And for me, confession is not about being guilt-ridden or beating ourselves up. It is about naming the whole truth and saying there are places that may have done damage in the past and have something to learn from that, and that can inform how we move forward. So that's just part of the owning our whole history, I guess.
And I think the sense I get is that the church is very conscious, as you mentioned, both of being almost downtown, in the heart of downtown,
Yeah.
and having a mission larger than just Sunday services. You've done some really interesting things. You put up a labyrinth on the lawn.
Yeah.
That lawn has hosted townwide meetings after national tragedies. You host dozens of 12-step meetings.
Yes.
Why?
That's a great question, Dan. And I often say that open door policy at Saugatuck Church is part of our DNA. It precedes me by decades. We have always seen ourselves as a partner to the wider community and a collaborator. When I think about my own faith, part of what's core to that faith is community building beloved community, right? Creating community tomorrow that is somehow healthier and more inclusive and more healthy and more united than it was yesterday, right? Always moving toward that vision of a community where all people will thrive. So we want to be contributors to that kind of community. And one of the assets that we have is our space. That's a thing we can do. We can open our doors. We can say, hey, y'all come on in and use this space and let it be for you gathering space or healing space or recovery space or connecting space. That's just core to our mission. And we love seeing the people that move in and out of our building over time.
The building also has a very large, very visible Black Lives Matter banner hanging over the front door. And that's, you're in town and everyone sees it. Again, where did that come from? And I'm sure it created at least some controversy. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about that?
Sure. So the banner isn't actually up at the moment. It was there for a period of almost a year and was an installation initiated by our arts and ministry team. So it was envisioned as a temporary installation at a time where it felt important to offer support to communities of color, particularly in the wake of 2020 and the violence of that summer and the conversations that have emerged all around our nation about systemic racism. There was a kind of turning on the lights or exposing that systemic racism during the summer that I think got a lot of folks talking. And so our own members wanted to find a way of acknowledging the hurt and the pain of Black and brown communities. They brought their proposal for a banner to our council, which is our leadership team, which unanimously supported the idea. So it was an initiative that got the backing of the leadership. And when we made that decision, we said we want this to be more than a sign, right? So we asked ourselves, what are we going to be doing as a congregation behind the scenes that demonstrates our own interest in understanding racism better, unpacking it, and contributing to dismantling it over time? So over the course of that year, we were engaged in an anti-racism workshop, and then in some of the efforts that were town-wide, another place where we partnered with the whole community through having Layla Saad, the author of Me and White Supremacy, who was our keynote speaker for the Dr. Martin Luther King event last year. And then there were some small group reading sessions that grew out of that, and some of our members participated there. So we tried to create some opportunities for our folks to continue to dig in and do some learning and have some conversation. That also is ongoing, this sort of where do we take this next? I think we will always have more to learn, more to unpack, and more that needs to be done to address racism in our own community. I'm really proud of what Westport as a community has been doing on that front. And my hope is that Saugatuck Church can be a part of that and take advantage of that good work that our whole community is doing.
Is there pushback?
Sure, there's always pushback. I mean, in the culture right now, there's so, I mean, I don't have to, it's sort of become the thing we say at the beginning of all conversations that our country is particularly divided right now. I would observe that the pandemic has really done a number on us, that there is no one in this country who isn't a little frayed at the seams, that there is no one who is not grieving something. Even those of us who may have made it through the pandemic without losing a loved one, had routines disrupted, had lives upended in one way or another, and we're carrying that stress and that grief. So racism was already hard to talk about, and now we're a bunch of stressed folks trying to find our way through a conversation about racism. So yeah, there's pushback. And important conversations are usually hard, and that's okay. We still need to lean into them.
So what does all this mean for you as a pastor? I mean, you're dealing with as you mentioned, a polarized nation, and I think the past few months with the election season has been a little more fraught than most of our elections. As a pastor with a congregation, has your role changed in the past couple of years?
I'm trying to think, Dan, if the role has changed or the work itself has changed. So I think of myself, and my role is as a pastor and community builder, as also a person who names with our community what sort of casting that vision for a beloved community and what we're working towards. That's part of my role, collaborating with the community. So I'm doing all of those things. But what that looks like is maybe different in the wake of the pandemic. So practically speaking, we've been figuring out how to do things remotely. We've been figuring out what it looks like to connect with people in the next state or in the next country when we can't always be together in person. That's been a major change in my own daily work as a pastor. I am way more tech savvy than I was a year and a half ago. So here's the thing. This has also been a time, I think, of rich creativity. And for those of us who have had a little space to breathe, right? So there are those who just haven't because of the demands of the pandemic and the implications for their own work. But because we've all been unsettled, it's the perfect opportunity to say, oh, we can in fact do things differently, right? It turns out we can do community when we can't be in person. It may not be ideal all the time. There are also gifts that are added by doing remote community. It turns out we can cut pollution. We can slow down the pace at which we move through our days, right? All of that is possible. And we adapted.
Yeah.
So if we could do those things, then I get to ask, and we as a community get to ask, what else is possible? What else can we do to address the climate crisis? What else can we do to make community even more accessible and inclusive? What else can we do to operate differently as community if going back to normal, for example, brown and black communities, isn't desirable, right? We don't want to go back to embracing that systemic racism. We want to do some things differently. So on all of those fronts, I think we have the opportunity to have some really rich and creative conversation right now. That's what's been distinctive about this past year and a half.
And in terms of Westport, what's kept you here? What do you love about this place? When you got here almost 10 years ago and you were welcomed and embraced, is that feeling still here? What have you learned about this place? Talk a little bit about the community of Westport.
Yeah. So what keeps me there is those partnerships. In addition to pastoring to the community of folks that I see every Sunday or at meetings during the week, the people who self-identify as members of Saugatuck Church, I get to hang out with the folks on Team Westport. I get to hang out with the interfaith community. I get to collaborate with the Westport Library, with the Museum of History and Culture, with Scout Troop 36, for which Saugatuck is the charter organization. Sherwood Island, Sustainable Westport. These are groups doing amazing things. They're all groups with whom we've partnered in one way or another. And what's happened over the course of 10 years is I've had the gift of becoming embedded in this community. And knowing that I've got folks that I can reach out to if I've got an idea, knowing that there are people who will reach back to us and say, hey, would you come along because we've got this important work that we're doing? That's remarkable, and it's not a given. Not all communities have, for example, interfaith clergy that work as collaboratively as we do. And we inherited that from our predecessor clergy at many of our institutions. That preceded us, but it continues.
Yeah, you've mentioned the interfaith clergy several times. It's pretty important to you.
It's a great and faithful group of folks, and yeah, it's that my work gets to be embedded not only in a specific congregation but within the community of which we're a part. Just keeps things interesting and dynamic and meaningful. And it's a beautiful community. It's a coastal community with remarkable natural resources and people who have cared about looking after those resources historically, and that's meaningful to our family too.
And you love the Sunday services at Campo Beach in the summer.
Those are a huge hit all around. Those are a popular favorite, yep.
So the last question is, speaking of beauty and environmentalism and the planet, you got some big news.
We do have some big news. Yeah, the Lilly Foundation, a national foundation, offers grants to clergy called clergy renewal grants that are awarded to congregations to support a time away for pastors. So ironically, having just spent all this time talking about how much I cherish the partnerships in Westport, we've been awarded a grant that allows me to take a 3-month sabbatical away from my work here. And I will be focusing that time getting to explore the biodiversity of two different areas, the Maldives, where I'll be involved in some marine conservation, and then my family and I will be staying on a regenerative farm in Costa Rica for a period of time, which is amazing and incredibly exciting. But equally exciting is that my congregation will be taking that same time for some rest and renewal as a community, and we'll be focusing on embracing our coastal community, soaking up so much of what this region has to offer, and also deepening our understanding of the climate crisis and how it impacts us here locally, so that we can then do some meaningful work to address the climate crisis.
So it sounds like the 300-year-old church is getting ready for the next 300 years.
I hope so. It definitely feels like we are stepping out into the next season as a congregation. And environmental justice is going to be a part of that, has already been a part of that. Frankly, the pandemic contributed to that because we spent a lot more time outside, worshiping outside, going on hikes together because it was safer to be outside, and it gave us a way of being together. And it reminded us how much we cherish the natural world, how connected we are to it, and how critical it is at this juncture for us to take action to save the planet from the climate crisis. So that's where we are.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So people who pass by Saugatuck Church and see this historic, very New England, very traditional building near the center of town, there's a lot going on that is very untraditional but very important as well.
There's a lot going on, and we're glad to be a part of it, and we're glad to do it with the folks with whom we share this community.
And I'm glad to have spent the past half hour with Reverend Allison Patton, Saugatuck Congregational Church. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Dan.